So what if jump devastators with autocannons? Let's talk about Primaris Suppressors in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd focus on the Suppressor Squad, perhaps one of the less well-known variants of the Primaris, hiding away in their Vanguard box sets. In the video we'll talk about the models briefly, then go over their datasheets, any obvious buffs and synergies that they can have, and how they stack up compared with the other Codex Space Marine units for their battlefield role. First up, the miniatures for the suppressors are a bit weird compared with the rest of the Primaris range. For the most part, Games Workshop often released a lot of models with monopose kits for the Space Marines, and then also followed up with multi-part ones. Say for example, the Intercessors in Dark Imperium, or the Infiltrators or the Eliminators in the Shadow Spear box. Weirdly enough, the suppressors were a kit that got a model release where there were 3 of them that were released in Shadowspear, but for some reason these guys alone have been neglected and never received a single plastic kit release of their own. First they were in the Start Collecting box for Space Marines, then in the Combat Patrol, and now have found their way into the direct-only Vanguard Task Force, so if you want to buy them from Games Workshop, literally the only way is direct-only, and packaged alongside 3 Eliminators, 10 Infiltrators, and a Primaris Lieutenant. I guess you could perhaps kit bash them without too much difficulty from some other things with autocannons perhaps, but definitely not the easiest to get a hold of right now. In terms of their place in the lore, they're kind of weird for their armor mark. Apparently the armor mark is called Omnis armor, and is supposedly supposed to be a weird fusion between both Gravis and Phobos designs, and also having the grav chutes and foot plates similar to the Inceptors, which allow them to be dropped into battle from high altitudes. Typically in the Space Marine armory, they're usually used as supporting firepower for Vanguard Space Marines, so infiltrators, incursors, and the like, being able to pose a pretty serious threat to heavy infantry and light vehicles with their rapid-fire autocannons. Models-wise, I'd say they're okay as Primaris go. I feel like they're ones that divide opinions a bit more than others, maybe. I certainly saw a few people convert these guys into poses that are just standing and shooting the autocannons, even if they're still equipped with jump packs, which maybe looks like a bit more of a natural pose perhaps, plus the flying bases do have a bit of an issue with braking. Getting into the rules though, and the Suppressor Squad's datasheet is this one. They're 85 points for a squad of 3 of them, you can't take any more or less. And they're fast moving units with deep strike as you'd expect from the jump packs, they move 12 inches, and being quite cheap infantry units with deep strike can be pretty handy for doing things like secondary objectives. Durability wise, they just have the stat line of a standard Primaris Space Marine, 2 wounds with toughness 4 and a 3+ save, which I would say puts them as one of the units that's more fragile than most in the Space Marine army. Even units like Stern Guard are considered not too hard to take down for the 20 points per the same stat line. These guys are almost 30 points, so in general I'd say that durability is a huge weakness for them. Otherwise they're objective control 1, so don't fight for objectives too hard compared with some, and have a standard sort of Primaris Space Marine threat in melee. 3 attacks at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1 can be genuinely okay to help clear a few more light infantry if needed. The main event for them is of course their autocannons, 3 attacks at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 with a very good 48-inch range so they can strike at enemies halfway across the battlefield, and they hit on 4+ on the move or a 3+ if they're stationary with the heavy keyword. It does mean that they are still stuck with their old problems of either having to choose between hitting on a 4+ if they actually use their good movement characteristics or their deep strike, or have to remain stationary if they don't want to give up a chunk of their damage output. The range is definitely handy enough though, it's kind of nice to have shots like that can go all the way into the enemy's backfield to maybe reach out and threaten things that otherwise might have been kind of safe. The damage profile is one that is really quite specific though. It's going to be fairly threatening to things with certain profiles, usually between say toughness 4 and toughness 7, things without too good saves, but it's going to really struggle hard against things like vehicles. For their damage output for one suppressor squad you get roughly these numbers. This is the value for the squad on the move if they are making use of that good movement to either deep strike in before dealing damage or jump around to get lines of sight or something. And if so, then hitting on a 4+, they'd kill around about 3 Tyranid Termagants, 2 enemy Space Marines, 2 wounds to Terminators, or only 1 or 2 wounds to a vehicle with a 3+ save and no cover. With those numbers, I'd kind of rate that as kind of mediocre against anything but the Space Marines really. For the points cost, I think they do have some pretty good damage into enemy Astartes, and particularly if they can remain stationary at good range. Perhaps even more ideal targets might be things like, say, Drukhari Venoms or mid-toughness Chaos Demons that they wound on a 3+. Middle strength, lots of shots and damage too, could stack some fair numbers against them, though I feel like they're definitely a unit that's good against some armies but might be near useless against some armies that you fight. If you say fighting against Chaos Knights or something, then only getting a single failed save on average, even if stationary, just really isn't very good. In reality though, their kind of mediocre damage might be partly paying for their special rule, which I think does have some genuine value. Suppression fire means that after the unit shot in your shooting phase, you nominate one enemy unit that you've hit with an autocannon shot, and until the start of your next turn, that enemy unit will be -1 to hit, both when shooting and when fighting. I'd say -1 to hit rules aren't usually worth an enormous amount of, say, points and value by themselves, but they're definitely not nothing. If you were able to ping that into a really powerful enemy unit while they're dealing their damage, then it could meaningfully affect how many Space Marines get killed in your opponent's turn. I guess maybe the dream might be to have the chance to be able to hit something like a big shooty enemy battle tank or a knight or a really massive infantry squad or something, a unit where -1 to hit is almost certainly going to add up to some models in your army saved. The rule does have a weakness though, and it only takes effect while the Suppressor squad is still on the battlefield, which definitely could be an issue given that there are only 6 wounds worth of Space Marines. It means that if you're just in a big shooting match with a whole bunch of enemy units and everyone can see each other, there's at least the possibility that a different enemy shooting unit could gun down the Suppressors, and then the big unit that you debuffed might just be able to act completely normally as the rule no longer takes effect. Even in that case though, I guess it could mess with your opponent's target priorities, which would still have a little bit of value. Overall, putting the unit strengths and weaknesses together, I'd say they're somewhat flexible, both the potential to be a damage dealer, a debuff unit, and an interference secondary unit. For their weaknesses, their durability is just flat out bad. Marine profiles for 28 points or so just isn't ideal whatsoever. Their damage output is kind of okay, but just really quite specific to being good against certain armies and not against others. Though I guess it does mean that you could perhaps feel them to actually use their damage a bit more against an army that they can really damage well. Otherwise though, you could just pretty much use them as a cheap unit for deep strike to pick up secondary points, say things where you have to be in certain areas of the board, like behind enemy lines or engage on all fronts, or deploy teleport homers or something. 85 points maybe isn't too bad for that, and with a fair few of those while they're deep striking in to do so, then they could actually threaten some okay damage. And after that, have a 12-inch movement where they're still going to cause problems for the foe. The -1 to hit rule I feel like is a nice to have, maybe it isn't enough just to take the unit outright for that alone, but I guess if they do get the opportunity to put that on a target where it's really meaningful, that could actually be the difference between your opponent inflicting a bit more damage on your army or not doing so. Between all those options, I feel like there's enough to be interesting, it's just whether or not it can outcompete other things for the same roles in the Space Marine Codex. For supporting the unit, I feel like in general they're a unit that just doesn't really want too much investment realistically. They're only 85 points, so any buffs that you could give them that could be better served on other bigger and more threatening units are probably going to get the pick over the suppressors. Though it could have been a bit different if Games Workshop suddenly decided to make them a 6 model unit or something, though I guess that's not happening this edition. Oath of Moment's always helpful for amping up their damage output. With a long range, they could easily contribute to the Oath of Moment target even if they're not particularly near it on the battlefield. I guess it could be particularly helpful for their firepower if they're going to be hitting on a 4+ due to having moved. They do have plenty of stratagem options, both from the core ones and Armour of Contempt, and they do have the smoke keyword as well for a -1 to hit and cover if it made sense. I feel like it might be a bit of a last-ditch effort though to try and make the squad just have every chance of surviving on an objective or something, as even using Smoke or Armour of Contempt isn't really going to make them into a tough unit. It just might potentially save one of them or something if the opponent can only bring some guns to bear on them. For character support, it's really quite simple. 0 characters can lead them. Kind of a shame that jump pack characters can't really, even if it wouldn't really be the best idea for most of them in the first place. I guess having a slightly unusual, unique armor mark, like maybe the Inceptors with their jump packs, means that they're just bereft of support like that. For detachment buffs, I feel like most of them do at least something interesting for them. Ironstorm Spearhead's reroll at a single hit or wound roll is a small damage boost. Gladius gives them easy access to fall back and shoot and advance and shoot, both of which are nice. The Firestorm Assault Force does as well, and I guess that +1 to wound stratagem might be alright in a pinch. And I feel like the Anvil Siege Force is kind of interesting for them as well. If you did want to use them for static firepower for a game, then those Strength 8 autocannons look a lot more scary with both +1 to hit and +1 to wound. Maybe one of the single most interesting ones though might be the Vanguard Spearhead. Cover and stealth at greater than 12 inches do genuinely help out their survivability a bit, perhaps not going to be quite as trivial to take down, and they could be an alright choice for return to reserve for 1 command point for a deep strike shooting unit. Perhaps after they're dropped to do a secondary or something, they could return to reserve and then threaten the same later in the game. The +1 to hit and +1 AP stratagem could be pretty meaningful for them as well against an optimal target. I feel like that one might be good enough to be used for the damage output against things like save 3+ enemy Space Marines. Having your suppressors hitting on a 3+ even on the move, and those autocannons on AP2 could easily account for at least one other casualty if it's critical. Otherwise, given not much interaction with characters, they feel like a bit of a niche unit for the more divergent chapters. They'll get the standard detachment buffs like Deathwatch and Black Spear, giving them sustained or lethal hits. They like the Tome of Ectoclades, and they could be part of a Spectrus kill team if you wanted to field one of those. Black Templars have their Feel No Pain that they might be able to get, and Dark Angels have some niche stratagem support. Though in general I feel like they're not a unit that changes enormously depending on these divergent chapters, maybe in the same way that other slightly cheaper support units might not care as much about the detachment buffs. For competitors, I'd generally be ranking them against the other Space Marine utility units for a role in the list, given that they're both hideously fragile for the points and also a damage output that's not that great at dealing with heavier targets. I wouldn't just be buying them in for their damage alone, so I guess they'd be competing against other things that can both have interesting utility use and also deal some damage of their own, things like Eliminators or Inceptors perhaps. I guess their damage output could be a bit more tempting in things like Anvil Siege Force, but realistically I think normally I wouldn't really be comparing them against other Space Marine mainline damage dealers, maybe things like Hellblasters, just due to them coming in big squads with better character synergy and making better use of stratagems and things. I'd say in 10th edition perhaps the biggest problem for why suppressors aren't seeing as much play are Inceptors. They're 25 points more expensive than a suppressor squad, and maybe have a similar sort of defensive overall profile given their Gravis armor for the upgrade, but their damage output tends to be a bit more generalist given full reroll wound rolls for their twin linked weapons, and more importantly they have that enormous 3-inch deep strike rule where they can just jump down and basically pretty much defeat enemy screening unless you're ridiculously tightly packed. The 3-inch drop is just big for almost guaranteeing that you can get secondary objectives, and Inceptors are one of the most popular and frequently included Space Marine units just in general, and maybe are stealing the suppressor's limelight as a result. I think the 3-inch drop is just generally going to be more helpful to have in the army compared with the -1 to hit debuff. Otherwise, Eliminators feel like they're in a similar sort of boat. Again, a cool utility unit with a bit of damage and some tricks. 3-man squads and are very fragile, but instead they get to infiltrate, have stealth, and get to move, shoot, move if they have the Instigator Bolt Carbine, plus are a little bit cheaper. Scouts and jump pack intercessors are other things that could rival them for pop-up units to do secondary objectives, Scouts being a bit cheaper, jump pack intercessors being a bit tougher than melee damage as opposed to range. In general though, between all those competitors, I've just very rarely seen suppressors in competitive lists in 10th edition so far. Realistically, I don't think that they're so far behind some of these, but I feel like in particular the Inceptors mean that people rarely look at them twice. Overall, at the moment in Codex Space Marines, I'd rate suppressors as not usually going to be people's top choice, but certainly not unusable. I think they're a unit that would probably vary depending on opponent and matchup, though perhaps the default plan would be to reserve them and drop in to do secondary objectives and provide autocannon fire support and the -1 to hit debuff when they do, with maybe a backup plan against the right opponent when they can genuinely threaten some really big damage on key units. You could potentially flex them into being more of a fire support unit, perhaps particularly if they could sit safe somewhere with a good line of sight and outrange the enemy so they can't hit them back with those big long range autocannons. In general, I feel like their movement and utility is probably going to have more value than that overall, but I guess if you're fighting against a whole load of, say, light skimmers that they can just absolutely ruin, then the latter might be better. Overall though, standard plan would be to drop them in to help with secondary support, hopefully gun down a unit they're effective against, and potentially think about pinging one suppressor into an enemy unit that's going to be dealing some good damage next turn and you can't kill, just to make them a little bit less effective while the suppressors live. Given their durability stats though, if they survive beyond that, I'd treat it as a bonus. In any case though, let me know what you think about the suppressors in 10th edition. Have you been using them regularly in your army, and how well have they been doing so far? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see similar videos to this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and we'll certainly have plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.